A judge with a disability is about to sentence a powerful millionaire businessman accused of fraud when he discovers the defendant is his father, who abandoned him 25 years ago. What happens next will change their lives forever. Before we dive into this emotional story, comment below, do you believe it's possible to forgive a family betrayal after so many years? Now brace yourself for a journey of intense emotions. The rising sun over New York illuminated the luxurious office of Robert Anderson, CEO of Anderson Enterprises and one of Wall Street's most powerful men. At 55, Robert was the embodiment of the American success story, wealthy, influential, and respected. But behind the facade of power, a dark secret consumed him. As Robert prepared for another multi-million-dollar negotiation, his cold gaze wandered over the panoramic view of the city. His empire was vast, but the price he had paid for it was unimaginable. "Mr. Anderson, your video conference starts in 5 minutes, his assistant announced. Robert adjusted his silk tie, an automatic gesture that masked his inner turmoil. 2 decades ago, he had made a choice that would define not only his destiny, but that of a family he had abandoned. That morning, Robert didn't know his past was about to catch up with him. Soon he would face the consequences of his actions in a courtroom before the son he had rejected. Robert's empire was about to crumble, and redemption would be his greatest challenge. It was a summer night in New York when Sarah Anderson went into labor. Robert, her husband, drove frantically through Manhattan's busy streets, cutting through traffic with the determination of a man on a mission. At 30, Robert was already a promising entrepreneur, owner of a tech startup that was beginning to catch the eye of Wall Street investors. The birth of his first child was the next step in his vision of a perfect life. Upon arriving at the hospital, Sarah was quickly taken to the delivery room, while Robert was left behind, nervously pacing back and forth in the waiting room. Hours passed slowly, each minute feeling like an eternity. Finally, a doctor appeared with a tired smile. "Congratulations, Mr. Anderson. It's a boy." Robert felt a wave of emotions wash over him: joy, pride, fear. He followed the doctor to the room where Sarah rested, exhausted but radiant, holding a small bundle in her arms. "Hello, Jason," Sarah whispered, looking at the baby adoringly. "Welcome to the world." Robert cautiously approached, looking at his son's face for the first time. Jason had Sarah's blue eyes and Robert's strong chin. He was perfect, or at least, so it seemed. In the days that followed, while Sarah and Jason were still in the hospital, doctors performed a series of routine tests on the newborn. It was during these tests that they discovered something that would change the course of their lives forever. "Mr. and Mrs. Anderson," the pediatrician said, his face serious, "Jason's test results have come in, and there's something we need to discuss." The doctor explained that Jason was born with a rare genetic condition that would affect his physical and cognitive development. He would need special care, constant therapies, and possibly face challenges throughout his life. Sarah, still recovering from childbirth, squeezed Robert's hand, seeking comfort and strength. "We'll get through this together," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Jason is our son, and we'll love him no matter what." Robert, however, remained silent. His mind was in turmoil, processing the implications of the diagnosis. He thought about his growing company, the plans he had made for the future, the image he had built for himself in New York society. How would a child with a disability fit into that picture? In the days that followed, Robert became increasingly distant, while Sarah devoted herself entirely to Jason's care, learning everything she could about his condition and adapting to the new reality. Robert spent more and more time at the office. "It's just temporary," he told himself. "I need to ensure the company is stable so we can afford Jason's care." But as weeks turned into months, it became clear that Robert was distancing himself not just physically, but emotionally from his family. He avoided holding Jason, rarely participated in medical appointments, and when he was home, spent most of his time locked in his office. Sarah desperately tried to reach him. "Robert, please," she begged one night as he prepared to leave for another late meeting. "Jason needs you. I need you. We can't do this alone." Robert looked at her, his eyes cold and distant. "I'm doing what I have to do, Sarah. Someone has to make sure we can pay for all of this. The tension at home grew every day. Robert started sleeping on the couch, avoiding the bedroom where Sarah spent sleepless nights caring for Jason. Family meals, once a time of connection, were now silent and uncomfortable. It was on a rainy autumn night that Robert finally made his decision. Sarah had just put Jason to bed after a particularly difficult physical therapy session. She found Robert in the living room, a suitcase at his feet. "What's going on?" she asked, her heart racing with sudden fear. Robert couldn't look her in the eye when he answered, "I can't do this, Sarah. I'm not strong enough. You'll be better off without me." Sarah felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. "Robert, no, please don't do this. We can work through this together. Jason needs you, I need you." But Robert had already made his decision. With one last look at the stairs leading to Jason's room, he picked up his suitcase and walked out the door, leaving Sarah alone, crying on the living room floor. The next morning, Sarah woke to find an envelope on the kitchen table. Inside was a check for a substantial amount and a brief note. "Sarah, this should help with initial expenses. I've set up a trust fund for Jason that will cover his medical care. It's the best I can do. Robert." Sarah tore the note to pieces, her tears staining the paper. How would she explain this to Jason when he was older? How could she raise a child alone, especially a child with special needs? At that moment, looking at the crib where Jason slept peacefully, Sarah made a silent promise. She would be strong for both of them. She would give Jason all the love and support he needed, no matter the challenges they faced. Across town, Robert Anderson boarded a flight to the West Coast, determined to leave his past behind and build the empire he had always dreamed of. He told himself he was doing the right thing, that Sarah and Jason would be better off without him. But in the back of his mind, a persistent voice whispered that he was making the biggest mistake of his life. So began the separate journeys of two families, Sarah and Jason, united by love and determination, and Robert alone in his pursuit of success and power. Little did they know that years later, their paths would cross again in a way none of them could have predicted. The years following Robert's departure were a constant test of resilience for Sarah Anderson. Each day brought new challenges, but also small victories that she had learned to celebrate. Sarah woke before dawn, preparing for another intense day. While New York City still slept, she was already up, organizing Jason's medications, preparing his special breakfast, and reviewing the packed schedule of therapies and medical appointments. "Good morning, champion," Sarah smiled, entering Jason's room. At 5 years old, the boy already showed surprising determination. Despite the physical limitations imposed by his condition, his eyes shone with curiosity and intelligence. "Mom, is today swimming day?" Jason asked excitedly, his speech slightly slurred but full of enthusiasm. "Yes, dear. After school and physical therapy," Sarah replied, helping him get dressed. The daily routine was exhausting. Sarah juggled her part-time job as a teacher with Jason's constant care. Every penny was counted, every minute was precious. The trust fund left by Robert covered basic medical expenses, but was far from enough to provide Jason with all the opportunities Sarah wanted for him. On nights when Jason finally fell asleep, Sarah allowed herself a few moments of weakness. Sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by bills and medical reports, she sometimes wondered how she would manage to continue. But then her eyes would fall on the photo of Jason smiling after his first successful physical therapy session, and she found renewed strength. As Jason grew, his vibrant and determined personality became increasingly evident. At 10 years old, despite motor difficulties, he stood out in school for his sharp intelligence and thirst for knowledge. "Mom, why is the sky blue?" Jason asked one day, his eyes fixed on the Manhattan skyline. Sarah smiled, recognizing the familiar gleam of curiosity in her son's eyes. "Well, it's because of the way sunlight interacts with Earth's atmosphere," she began to explain, marveling at Jason's ability to absorb complex information. It was around this time that Sarah first noticed Jason's growing interest in issues of justice and equality. He often questioned why some people treated him and other children with disabilities differently. "It's not fair, Mum," Jason said one day after an incident in the park where other children refused to play with him. "Why? Do people judge before they get to know someone?" Sarah hugged her son, her heart heavy but full of pride for Jason's sensitivity. "Some people are afraid of what they don't understand, dear. But you can show them that being different doesn't mean being less capable or less valuable." These conversations planted the seeds of what would become Jason's passion for justice. As he entered his teens, his interest in human rights and advocacy grew. Sarah did her best to nurture this passion, taking him to lectures, getting books on the subject, and encouraging him to express himself. At 15, Jason surprised everyone by giving an emotional speech at school about inclusion and equality. His eloquence and conviction left teachers and classmates impressed. Sarah, sitting in the audience, could barely contain her tears of pride. "You were amazing, Jason," she said after the event, hugging him tightly. "Your father would be so proud." It was the first time in years that Sarah had mentioned Robert, and Jason noticed the shadow that passed over his mother's face. "Mom, do you think he'll ever come back?" Jason asked hesitantly. Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "I don't know, dear. But what I do know is that you are strong, intelligent, and capable of anything you set your mind to, with or without him." As Jason approached high school graduation, his determination to become a lawyer solidified. He spent hours studying for college admission exams, determined to get into one of the best law schools in the country. Sarah watched with a mixture of pride and apprehension. She knew the path Jason had chosen wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that if anyone could overcome the obstacles, it was her resilient and determined son. The night the acceptance letter from Columbia Law School arrived, Sarah and Jason celebrated as if they had won the lottery. It was more than an academic victory. It was proof that years of struggle, determination, and unconditional love had paid off. "We did it, Mom," Jason said, hugging Sarah tightly. "No, you did it," Sarah corrected, tears of joy in her eyes. "I just had the privilege of being by your side." As mother and son celebrated across town in his luxurious office, Robert Anderson looked out the window, feeling a void that no financial success could fill. Little did he know that fate was about to reconnect the paths he had so drastically separated years ago. Anderson Enterprises was growing at a dizzying pace. What had started as a small tech startup soon transformed into a diversified conglomerate, with interests in software, biotechnology, and luxury real estate. Robert, now in his 50s, was seen as a visionary, a man who turned everything he touched into gold. On sunny mornings in San Francisco Bay, Robert contemplated the panoramic view from his penthouse office. Below, the city bustled with activity, but he felt strangely disconnected from it all. "Mr. Anderson, your meeting with investors starts in 10 minutes, his assistant announced, interrupting his thoughts. Robert adjusted his silk tie, an automatic gesture that masked the inner turmoil. He entered the conference room with the confidence of a man who had conquered the business world. The investors looked at him with a mixture of admiration and envy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert began, his voice firm and controlled, "we are on the brink of a technological revolution that will change the world as we know it." As he presented the company's latest projects, part of Robert wondered if anyone in the room perceived the emptiness behind his words. They saw the successful magnate, the billionaire on magazine covers, but not the man who woke up every morning feeling that something fundamental was missing. The nights were the worst. In his penthouse apartment overlooking the Golden Gate, Robert found himself alone with his thoughts. Sometimes he caught himself looking at an old family photo hidden in a drawer. Sarah, smiling, holding baby Jason. The image haunted him, reminding him of the life he had left behind. Trying to fill the void, Robert threw himself into superficial relationships. Models, actresses, socialites, all attracted by his power and wealth, but none could penetrate the armor he had built around his heart. "Royert, you seem distant," his latest girlfriend, a young executive from a rival tech company, commented. "Is something wrong?" "Just thinking about work," he replied automatically, turning to look at the illuminated city through the window. Work was his refuge, his obsession. Each new acquisition, each innovative project was an attempt to prove his worth, to justify the choice he had made so many years ago. But the satisfaction of each conquest was ephemeral, soon replaced by an insatiable desire for more. On a particularly tense afternoon, after closing a multi-million-dollar deal, Robert found himself alone in his office, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him. His reflection in the window glass stared accusingly at him. Was it worth it? He asked himself aloud, the words escaping before he could contain them. At that moment, something inside him broke. The tears he had long repressed finally came to the surface. Robert cried silently, years of regret and guilt finally finding an outlet. The next morning, determined to change something in his life, Robert decided to make a substantial donation to a charity that supported children with disabilities. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant considering his fortune, but for him, it represented a hesitant first step towards redemption. News of the donation reached Sarah and Jason in New York. Jason, now a young adult about to graduate from IT law school, was intrigued by the gesture of the father he had never known. "Mom, do you think he thinks about us?" Jason asked, showing Sarah the online news. Sarah hesitated, her conflicting emotions visible on her face. "I don't know, dear. Sometimes people do things for reasons they don't fully understand themselves." Back in San Francisco, Robert found himself thinking more and more about his past. He began discreetly researching Sarah and Jason, using his resources to obtain information about their lives. When he discovered that Jason was about to graduate in law, he felt a mixture of pride and shame so intense it nearly knocked him over. "He made it despite me," Robert murmured to himself, looking at a recent photo of Jason that his investigation team had obtained. The guilt and regret that Robert carried began to weigh more and more heavily. He had become one of the most powerful men in the business world, but at what cost? His relentless pursuit of success and power had left him empty inside, a man rich in material goods but poor in genuine human connections. One night, sitting alone in his office, Robert made a decision. He wrote a letter to Jason, explaining who he was and expressing his desire to reconnect. But before he could send it, his courage failed. The letter ended up locked in a drawer, a silent testimony to his unrealized hopes and fears. Meanwhile, fate was about to intervene in a way that neither Robert nor Jason could have predicted. The choices of the past were about to collide with the present, forcing father and son to confront the truth that had been buried for so long. Robert Anderson, the business titan, was about to face his greatest challenge, not in corporate courts or boardrooms, but in the court of conscience and heart. Columbia Law School's campus was buzzing with activity on graduation day. Among the crowd of gowns and caps, Jason Anderson stood out, not only for his wheelchair, but for the determination radiating from his eyes. "You did it, son," Sarah said, tears of pride streaming down her face as she adjusted Jason's gown. "Your father would be so proud." Jason smiled, but a shadow passed over his eyes at the mention of his absent father. "Thank you, Mom. I couldn't have gotten here without you." As names were called, the audience cheered. When it was Jason's turn, a respectful silence fell over the auditorium, followed by an explosion of applause. Jason maneuvered his wheelchair onto the stage, accepted his diploma with a radiant smile, and held it up in triumph. That night, during the celebration, Jason shared his plans with his mother and close friends. "I'm going to specialize in civil rights," he announced. "I want to ensure that people with disabilities have the same opportunities as everyone else." The years that followed were of hard work and tireless dedication. Jason began his career in a small law firm, dealing mainly with pro bono cases for people with disabilities. His sharp legal skills and unique empathy made him a formidable lawyer. A particularly challenging case involved a child with a condition similar to his own who was denied access to a public school. Jason worked day and night, researching precedents, preparing arguments, and finally presenting the case before the court. "Your Honor," Jason argued, his voice firm and passionate, "denying this child the right to education is not only illegal, it's an affront to the fundamental principles of equality on which our nation is based." The victory in this case was a turning point in his career. Jason quickly gained a reputation as a fierce advocate for civil rights, especially for people with disabilities. His unique perspective and ability to connect with clients and juries made him a force to be reckoned with in New York courts. As his reputation grew, Jason began receiving offers from large law firms. However, he remained true to his mission, preferring to continue his work on civil rights cases. "I'm not in this for the money, Mom," he explained to Sarah one night. "I'm here to make a difference." Sarah, who had always supported her son's choices, couldn't be more proud. "You're already making a difference, Jason. More than you can imagine." At 35, Jason received news that would change his life. He was nominated for a position as a judge in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. The appointment was received with wide support from the legal community and advocates for the rights of people with disabilities. On the day of his investiture, the court was packed. Sarah, sitting in the front row, could barely contain her tears as she watched her son take the oath. "I, Jason Anderson, do solemnly swear that I will administer justice without respect to persons and do equal right to the poor and to the rich." His voice resonated through the courtroom, clear and determined. As a judge, Jason quickly gained a reputation for his impartiality, wisdom, and deep understanding of the law. His verdicts were frequently cited in other cases, and he became known for his compassionate yet firm approach to applying justice. One day, while reviewing the cases scheduled for the next week, Jason came across a name that made his heart skip a beat. Anderson Enterprises was listed as the defendant in a high-profile corporate fraud case. "It can't be," Jason murmured, his mind racing to the father he had never known. After a quick search, his suspicions were confirmed. Robert Anderson, CEO of Anderson Enterprises, was the man who had abandoned him so many years ago. Now, by a twist of fate, father and son were about to meet in the courtroom. Jason spent the night sleepless, debating with himself. Should he refuse to judge the case due to the conflict of interest? Or was this the opportunity he had secretly longed for all his life? The chance to confront the man who had abandoned him. The next morning, Jason made his decision. He would not refuse to judge the case. His integrity as a judge and his commitment to justice were greater than any personal resentment. He would treat Robert Anderson as he would treat any other defendant in his court. "Mom," Jason called Sarah, his voice trembling but resolute. "He's coming back into our lives. Not in the way we expected, but he's coming back." Sarah was silent for a moment, absorbing the impact of the news. "What are you going to do, dear?" "What I've always done, Mom," Jason replied, a new determination in his voice. "I'll seek justice, for everyone." As the day of the trial approached, Jason prepared for the biggest challenge of his career and personal life. He knew that his actions in the coming days would not only define his future as a judge, but could finally bring closure to the unresolved chapter of his family history. The stage was set for a confrontation that no one could have predicted. An abandoned son, now invested with the power of the law, about to judge the father he never knew. Justice and destiny were about to intertwine in a way that would forever change the lives of Jason, Robert, and everyone around them. The federal court for the Southern District of New York was in an uproar that morning. Journalists crowded the entrance steps, cameras flashed incessantly, and the crowd's buzz grew with each passing minute. The trial of the century was about to begin. Robert Anderson, the business titan, would face charges of corporate fraud and tax evasion. Inside the majestic marble building, Judge Jason Anderson adjusted his black robe, trying to calm the nerves that threatened to overwhelm him. He had spent the night sleepless, mentally reviewing every detail of the case, determined not to let his personal emotions interfere with his duty. "All rise," announced the court officer, his resounding voice instantly silencing the courtroom. Jason entered, his wheelchair gliding silently down the central aisle. His eyes swept the room, pausing briefly on the imposing figure seated at the defense table. Robert Anderson, now with graying hair at his temples, maintained an impassive expression, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of recognition as they met Jason's. "Please be seated," Jason instructed, his voice firm and controlled. "We are here today for the case of United States versus Anderson Enterprises. The prosecution may make its opening statement." As the prosecutor outlined the charges against Robert and his company, Jason closely observed the man who was his biological father. 25 years had passed since Robert had abandoned his family, and now fate brought them together in the most unlikely manner possible. Robert, in turn, could barely take his eyes off the judge. The resemblance was undeniable. The same determined eyes, the same strong chin. A wave of emotions overwhelmed him: pride in what his son had become, shame for his own actions, and a deep regret that threatened to suffocate him. As the trial progressed, the tension in the room was palpable. Witnesses were called, evidence was presented, and heated arguments were exchanged between the prosecution and the defense. Jason presided over everything with admirable impartiality, his calm voice and measured decisions giving no indication of the emotional turmoil he was experiencing internally. During a recess, Sarah, who was watching the trial from the gallery, discreetly approached Jason in his chambers. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, concern evident in her eyes. Jason nodded slowly. "I'm doing what I need to do, Mom. Justice must be served, no matter who's in the dock." Sarah smiled sadly, proud of her son's strength, but feeling the pain he so carefully hid. Back in the courtroom, the moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. Robert Anderson was called to testify. As Robert took the oath, his eyes met Jason's again. For a brief moment, father and son stared at each other, decades of silence and absence weighing between them. "Mr. Anderson," the prosecutor began, "can you tell us why you felt it necessary to defraud investors and evade taxes on such a massive scale?" Robert hesitated, his eyes never leaving Jason's. I thought I was protecting my legacy. I built this company from nothing, and I wanted to ensure it survived at any cost." "And was that legacy worth more than your integrity?" the prosecutor pressed. It was at this moment that something inside Robert seemed to break. His voice, usually confident and assertive, trembled slightly as he replied, "No, that it wasn't. Nothing is worth the price I paid." A murmur ran through the room. Jason leaned slightly forward, his expression still neutral, but his eyes intensely focused on Robert. "Elaborate, Mr. Anderson," Jason instructed, his calm voice masking the storm of emotions within him. Robert swallowed hard, his eyes watering. "I've made many mistakes in my life, Your Honor. Mistakes that cost more than money or reputation. Mistakes that cost me everything that really mattered." The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone felt they were witnessing something deeper than a simple fraud trial. "Mr. Anderson," Jason spoke, his voice slightly softer, "this court is not here to judge your personal mistakes, but rather your actions as CEO of Anderson Enterprises. Please focus on the charges presented." Robert nodded, visibly shaken. "Yes, Your Honor. I admit that I authorized questionable practices in my company. I was obsessed with success, with proving my worth. But now I see that true worth isn't in the numbers of a bank account." The trial continued, with Robert answering questions from the prosecution and defense. But something had changed in the atmosphere of the room. Robert's initial arrogance had been replaced by a palpable humility, and his eyes often sought Jason's, as if silently begging for understanding. When the last testimony was heard and the final arguments were presented, Jason withdrew to deliberate. In his chambers, he struggled against the storm of emotions that threatened to engulf him. As a judge, he had a duty to be impartial. As a son, he yearned for answers, for some kind of resolution to the void he had carried all his life. After hours of intense reflection, Jason returned to the courtroom. The silence was absolute when he began to deliver his sentence. "Robert Anderson," Jason began, his voice firm, "this court finds you guilty of the charges of corporate fraud and tax evasion." Robert lowered his head, accepting the verdict. "However," Jason continued, "taking into account your admission of guilt and apparent remorse, as well as your willingness to cooperate with investigations, this court sentences you to 5 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation." A collective gasp ran through the room. The sentence was more lenient than many expected, but no one dared question the judge's decision. "Furthermore," Jason added, his voice now heavy with emotion, You shall create a foundation dedicated to supporting children with disabilities and their families, using half of your personal assets to fund it." Robert's eyes widened, meeting Jason's once again. At that moment, a silent understanding passed between father and son. "Court is adjourned," Jason declared, striking the gavel. As the room began to empty, Robert remained seated, looking smaller and more vulnerable than he had ever appeared in public. Jason, still in his seat, observed the man who was his father, a complex mixture of emotions passing across his face. Sarah, from the galleries, looked at her son with a mixture of pride and concern. She knew this wasn't the end, but only the beginning of a journey of healing and perhaps reconciliation. When everyone else had left, Robert slowly stood up and approached the judge's bench. "Jason," he said softly, his voice choked. "Not here," Jason interrupted, his voice firm but not hostile. "Not now." Robert nodded, understanding. As he was led away by officers, he cast one last look at Jason, years of regret and hope expressed in his eyes. Jason remained in his seat long, after everyone had departed, contemplating the uncertain future that lay before him. The verdict had been given, but the real trial, that of his heart, was just beginning. In the weeks following the trial, Jason Anderson's life was a whirlwind of emotions and reflections. The case had attracted national attention, and many questioned the impartiality of his decision, unaware of the personal connection between the judge and the defendant. One afternoon, as Jason was reviewing documents in his office, his secretary interrupted him. "Judge Anderson, there's a visitation request from Robert Anderson. He says it's urgent." Jason felt his heart race. He knew this moment would come, but he didn't expect it so soon. After a moment of hesitation, he nodded. "Let him in." Robert entered the room looking very different from the powerful CEO everyone knew. Dressed in prison uniform, he seemed smaller, older, more vulnerable. "Jason," Robert began, his voice trembling. "I know I have no right to be here, but I needed to see you." Jason motioned to a chair. "Sit down, Mr. Anderson. What brings you here today?" Robert sat down, his eyes never leaving Jason's. "I wanted to thank you. Your sentence, it was more than fair. It was redemptive." "I didn't come here seeking personal redemption," Jason replied, maintaining a professional tone. "My decision was based on the facts of the case and the law." Robert nodded slowly. "I understand, but Jason, there's so much I need to tell you, so many explanations I owe." "Mr. Anderson," Jason interrupted, "this is neither the place nor the time for personal discussions. I'm here as a judge, not as—" He stopped, unable to say the word son. Robert seemed to wilt even more. "Of course, I'm sorry, but Jason, please, when you're ready, I'll be here, ready to answer any questions, to try to fix what I broke so many years ago." As Robert was escorted out, Jason sat, immersed in thoughts. His biological father's words echoed in his mind, opening old wounds and awakening long-buried questions. In the days that followed, Jason found himself increasingly distracted. His nights were filled with restless dreams, memories of a fatherless childhood mixed with images of the broken man he had seen in court. Sarah, noticing her son's internal struggle, decided to intervene. One night, she showed up at Jason's apartment with a dusty box. "What's this, Mom?" Jason asked, curious. Sarah smiled sadly. "These are things I've kept over the years. Things about your father." Jason stood still for a moment, then slowly opened the box. Inside, he found old photos, unsent letters, and even a small teddy bear. "This was your favorite toy," Sarah explained, picking up the bear. "Robert gave it to you the day you were born." Jason held the toy, a wave of emotions washing over him. "Why did you keep all this?" Sarah sat beside her son, her eyes full of understanding. "Because, no matter what happened, he's a part of you, Jason. And I knew that one day you might want to understand your complete story." As they rummaged through the box together, Sarah shared stories Jason had never heard before. Stories of a young Robert, full of dreams and ambitions, but also full of fears and insecurities. He was so happy when he found out he was going to be a father, Sarah recalled, showing a photo of Robert holding a newborn Jason. But when we learned about your condition, something in him broke. Jason looked at the photo, seeing for the first time the love in his father's eyes. Why did he leave us, Mom? Why did he leave me? Sarah sighed deeply. Fear, Jason. Fear of failing. Fear of not being the father you deserved. He thought we'd be better off without him. The revelations continued late into the night. Jason learned about Robert's initial attempts to send money, which Sarah had refused, determined to raise her son on her own. He discovered the times Robert had called, drunk and full of remorse, only to hang up before anyone answered. He never stopped thinking about you, Sarah concluded. But time passed, and the distance grew. I think, in the end, he didn't know how to come back anymore. Jason was silent for a long time, absorbing everything. Finally, he turned to his mother, his eyes shining with unshed tears. You're amazing, you know, keeping all this, even after everything he did. Sarah smiled, caressing her son's face. Love is complicated, dear. It doesn't justify his actions, but maybe it helps to understand them. In the days that followed, Jason found himself on a journey of self-discovery. He revisited old memories, examined his own feelings, and finally made a decision. A week later, Jason found himself in front of the Federal Detention Center, where Robert was serving his sentence. With his heart racing, he announced himself and was led to a private visiting room. Robert was already there, his eyes lighting up, as he saw Jason enter. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of decades of separation hanging between them. Finally, Jason broke the silence. I have questions, he said simply. Robert nodded, his voice choked with emotion. And I have a lot to answer for. In the hours that followed, father and son began to unravel the knots of their shared past. Robert spoke about his fears, his failures, his regret. Jason, in turn, shared the pain of growing up without a father, the challenges he faced, and the victories he achieved. I'm sorry, Jason, Robert said, tears streaming down his face. I know these words aren't enough, but I'm sorry for every day I wasn't there for you. Jason looked at the man before him, seeing no longer the powerful businessman or the defendant in his courtroom, but simply a remorseful father. I can't promise everything will be okay between us, he said calmly, but I'm willing to try to understand, to try to forgive. When Jason left the prison that day, he felt different. The weight he had carried for so many years seemed a little lighter. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in his life, he felt complete. As he drove back home, Jason reflected on the surprising turns life could take. A trial that should have been just another case in his career had become the catalyst for healing old wounds and opening possibilities for a new chapter in his life. The reconciliation process was just beginning, but the revelations of that day had laid the groundwork for something Jason had never imagined possible, the chance to know and perhaps one day truly forgive his father. The months following the trial and initial revelations were an emotional roller coaster for Jason and Robert. While Robert served his sentence in federal prison, Jason struggled to balance his duties as a judge with his newly discovered connection to his father. On a sunny autumn afternoon, Jason received an unexpected call. It was from Robert's lawyer. Judge Anderson? The voice on the other end of the line sounded hesitant. Mr. Anderson would like to petition the court. He wants to confess additional crimes and accept a longer sentence in exchange for a more comprehensive rehabilitation program. Jason felt his heart tighten. I understand. Schedule a hearing for next week. In the courtroom a week later, the air was charged with tension. Robert, wearing his prison uniform, looked thinner and older than ever. His eyes, however, shone with a determination Jason had never seen before. Mr. Anderson, Jason began, maintaining a professional tone. I understand you wish to make a statement to the court. Robert stood up, his hands trembling slightly. Yes, Your Honor. I came here today not just to confess additional crimes, but to do something I should have done a long time ago. He paused, taking a deep breath, and then continued, his voice gaining strength. I want to ask for forgiveness. Not just to this court or to the people I've hurt with my corporate actions, but to you, Jason, my son. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Jason felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. "Mr. Anderson," he said, struggling to maintain composure, "this is not the appropriate place for—" "I know," Robert interrupted, tears now freely running down his face, "but I need everyone to hear this. I need the world to know how wrong I was and how much I want to make things right." Robert then turned to face the gallery where Sarah was sitting, her eyes wide with surprise. "Sarah," he said, his voice choked, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for abandoning you and our son when you needed me most. There's no excuse for what I did." Turning back to Jason, Robert continued, "And you, Jason, my amazing and brave son. I've missed so many years, so many precious moments. I should have been there for your first steps, your first words, your achievements and challenges. But instead I ran away, ran out of fear, out of cowardice." The courtroom was in absolute silence, everyone hypnotized by Robert's emotional confession. "I don't expect your forgiveness," Robert went on. "I know I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I'm willing to do anything to try to fix what I broke. That's why I'm here today, confessing everything. I don't want any more secrets, no more lies. I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be the man, the father you deserve." Jason struggled to maintain his professional composure, but his eyes betrayed the storm of emotions he felt. "Mr. Anderson," he said, his voice trembling, "the court acknowledges your confession. We will recess to review the new information and determine the next steps." As the room emptied, Jason remained in his seat, stunned. Sarah approached him, tears in her eyes. "Are you okay, dear?" she asked softly. Jason shook his head, unable to form words. Years of repressed anger, pain, and longing for an absent father came to the surface all at once. Hours later, when the court reconvened, Jason was ready to deliver his decision. Robert stood looking both scared and resigned. "Robert Anderson," Jason began, his voice firm, "this court acknowledges your voluntary confession and your desire for reparation. Taking this into account, along with your ongoing cooperation, your sentence will be adjusted." Robert nodded, bracing himself for the worst. "You will serve an additional 3 years in prison," Jason continued, "followed by 5 years of probation. During this time, you will work full-time at the foundation we established to support children with disabilities and their families." Robert looked at Jason, surprised by the leniency of the sentence. "Furthermore," Jason added, his voice softening slightly, "you will participate in weekly family therapy with us." Robert's eyes filled with tears of gratitude and hope. "Thank you, Your Honor. I won't waste this opportunity." When the session was adjourned, Jason stepped down from the bench and approached Robert. For a moment, the two stared at each other, years of pain and regret passing between them. Then, to everyone's surprise in the room, Jason extended his hand. "It's a long road ahead, Dad." Robert took Jason's hand, openly sobbing now. "I know, son, and I'm ready for every step of it." As father and son embraced for the first time in decades, Sarah watched from the gallery, her own tears falling freely. Forgiveness was a long and difficult process, she knew, but today marked the first step towards healing for their long, fragmented family. 3 years passed since that memorable day in court. Autumn had come again to New York, painting Central Park with shades of red and gold. On a bench near the lake, 3 figures sat together, their expressions a mixture of nervousness and hope. Jason, now 40, adjusted his wheelchair, looking at the 2 adults beside him. To his right, Sarah, her hair now sprinkled with grey, held his hand tightly. To his left, Robert, freshly released from prison, looked smaller and humbler than the powerful businessman he once was. "So," Jason broke the silence, "it's official. You're free." Robert nodded, a hesitant smile on his face. "Yes, thanks to you. Both of you," he added, looking at Sarah. Sarah offered a shy smile. The years of family therapy had helped heal many old wounds, but there was still a long way to go. "How do you feel?" Jason asked, genuinely curious. Robert took a deep breath, looking at the city skyline. "Scared, grateful, determined to do things right this time." The 3 sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of the moment. It was the first time they were together outside the walls of the prison or the therapy room. "The foundation is doing well," Jason commented, changing the subject. The scholarship program for children with disabilities is making a real difference. Robert smiled, proud. It's amazing what you've done with it, Jason. You've turned my mistakes into something truly good. We transformed it, Jason corrected. Your ideas and contacts were crucial. Sarah watched the interaction between father and son, her heart filling with an emotion she couldn't fully name. It was a mixture of joy, apprehension, and a tinge of melancholy for the lost time. You know, she said softly, 25 years ago, I never imagined we'd be here, the three of us together. Robert lowered his head, guilt still evident in his eyes. Sarah, No, she gently interrupted him. I'm not saying this to make you feel guilty. I'm saying it because I'm grateful. Grateful that we have this chance. Jason looked at his mother with admiration. Her strength and capacity to forgive always amazed him. So, Robert said after a moment, what happens now? Jason exchanged a look with Sarah before answering. Well, we have a spare room in the apartment. If you want, you can stay with us for a while, until you get settled. Robert's eyes filled with tears. You would do that for me? Sarah put a hand on Robert's shoulder. Family is family, Robert. It won't be easy, but we're willing to try if you are. Robert nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, it was choked with emotion. I promise, I'll do everything I can to deserve this second chance. The three of them stood up, Jason adjusting his chair, and began to walk slowly through the park. As they walked, they started to plan for the future. Robert spoke about his desire to dedicate himself fully to the foundation. Jason shared his ideas for expanding the legal support program for families of children with disabilities. Sarah, always the voice of reason, helped shape these dreams into concrete plans. As the sun began to set, painting New York's sky with shades of pink and orange, the three stopped to admire the view. You know, Jason said, breaking the contemplative silence, when I was a kid, I used to dream of moments like this, the three of us together, as a family. Robert put a hand on Jason's shoulder. I'm sorry it took so long to make that dream come true, son. The important thing is that we're here now, Sarah added, her voice soft but firm. Jason looked at his parents, feeling a wave of gratitude and love. So yes, we are, and we have the whole future ahead of us. As they returned home, Jason reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them here. From an abandoned baby to a respected judge, from an absent father to a man seeking redemption, from a broken family to one in the process of healing. It wasn't perfect, he knew. There would be difficult days ahead, old wounds that would occasionally open, new challenges to face. But looking at Robert and Sarah walking beside him, Jason felt something he had never experienced before, a sense of completeness. For the first time in his life, all the pieces seemed to be in the right place. When they arrived at the apartment, Robert hesitated at the door. Are you sure about this? He asked, the insecurity clear in his voice. Jason and Sarah exchanged a look and then together extended their hands to Robert. Welcome home, Dad, Jason said. With tears in his eyes, Robert took the offered hands and stepped forward, not just into the apartment, but into a new chapter of their lives. As the door closed behind them, the sound of soft laughter could be heard, the sound of a family, long separated, finally reunited and ready to face the future together. And so, we come to the end of this exciting journey of redemption, forgiveness, and new beginnings. The story of Jason, Robert, and Sarah reminds us that no matter how deep our wounds or how great our mistakes, there is always room for healing and reconciliation. Reflect for a moment on Jason's courage. Growing up without a father, facing physical challenges, and still becoming a respected judge. His journey teaches us about resilience and the importance of never giving up on our dreams, no matter the obstacles we face. And what about Sarah? Her strength as a single mother, her ability to love unconditionally, and even more impressively, her ability to forgive. She shows us that true love can overcome even the most painful betrayals. Robert, in turn, reminds us that it's never too late to acknowledge our mistakes and seek forgiveness. His journey from a selfish businessman to a repentant father teaches us about the importance of humility and the courage to face the consequences of our actions. Now I'd like to hear from you. How did this story touch your heart? Have you ever experienced a situation where you needed to forgive someone who deeply hurt you? Or perhaps you were the one who needed to ask for forgiveness. Share your experiences in the comments below. Let's create a space for dialogue and reflection where we can learn from each other and grow together. Remember, each of us has a story to tell, and every story has the power to touch and transform lives. That's why we continue to bring content like this to you. If this story touched your heart, if you felt inspired or moved, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support is crucial for us to continue producing content that not only entertains, but also inspires and provokes deep reflections. By subscribing, you become part of a community that values authentic and exciting stories. You help us reach more people, touch more hearts, and perhaps inspire more reconciliations in the real world. And it doesn't stop here. If you like this story, we have much more to offer. Explore our other videos for more exciting and inspiring narratives. Remember, every view, every comment, every subscription counts. You're not just watching a video, you're participating in a journey of transformation and growth. So, what are you waiting for? Click the subscribe button now, activate the bell to receive notifications, and join us on this incredible journey of discovery and emotions. Until the next video, where another exciting story waits to be told. Thank you for being with us, and remember, in the end, love and forgiveness always win.